No correr ni gritar, no entorpecer las vías de evacuación, alejarse de riesgos evidentes. Coopere con los miembros de seguridad siguiendo sus instrucciones. Diríjanse a la zona de seguridad. Muchas gracias por su atención. Ministerio para la Transición Ecológica y el Reto Demográfico.
encendido, ¿no? Vale. Buenos días y bienvenidos.
Good morning and welcome to Ministry for Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge. We're going to have this high-level dialogue of climate and dialogue. It's going to be moderated by Cristina Manzano, expert and member of EsGlobal and constituent member of Club of Madrid. Good morning. It's for me a pleasure to invite you to this very interesting, I'm sure, conversation. I think we don't need any presentation, any introducing of our participants. Thanks to Teresa Ribera, Vice President, Deputy Prime Minister of the Spanish government and Minister for Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge, Ban Ki-moon, ex-Secretary General of the United Nations and honorary member of the Club of Madrid. He is a key figure in Paris Agreement, and we have also Sandrine Dixson-Declève, co-chair of the Club of Rome, an organization that one of the first, if not the first one, to put on the table the challenges of the excessive use of resources, pollution, and demographic pressure. What we want to have this morning is a conversation among them, and also with you, of course, about at stage we are in this moment, at this stage of climate change. Where are we when almost nobody is anymore not conscious about the risks that it means? We have been seeing now in Europe a crisis, a heat wave we hadn't known before, and we are also very conscious that these phenomena are more and more recurrent, and we are also every time more conscious of this, but it has not always been done, the necessary things of the things that are on the table. These things affect especially the most vulnerable populations, so the relation between climate change and development are interlinked. We have Paris agreements have been a very special moment for fighting against these challenges. There are international compromises, and we know also these are nowadays not enough anymore for reaching our aims. The Agenda 2030 is also one of these important steps in this path, and we know that regulatorily we are not advancing, we are not getting forward with the speed we need and with enough compromise for whatever reasons, and now we're going to analyze some of them. And then we are also conscious, and last but not least, and that's I'm going to stop speaking, that all this process is followed by adequate financing that helps us to support this effort of society, of states, in order to get closer to these goals. As we have seen during the pandemic, to have access to a quick and dynamic financing helps to get good solutions. So the idea is that if we want, we can. That is the main conclusion I want to get to. So we have convinced that climate change is one of the biggest challenges we are facing today. Why are we not doing enough or at least with the right speed? First of all, I'd like to ask some questions. This would be more or less the general context, and I'd like to ask our Vice President about this contribution to continue fostering this agenda that is so important, specifically with regards to things that are like what happened now in Ukraine, where we have this perception that this is being a drawback in some of the compromises we need in order to continue fighting against climate change. Well, thank you very much, Cristina. Thank you to my dear two colleagues on the panel here on my left side for participating in this so interesting conversation, where we have also with the cameras broadcasting this event. I think some of the questions you are asking and the direction you gave us go directly to the point of the questions that need more attention at this moment, I think. It's true, there's generalization of by the society that understand that climate change is a big problem, but at the same time there are still dysfunctionalities, there are problems. There's a lack of knowledge about the consequences of these things that are being said. There is also a lack of behavior. We see these processes in the speed we need for getting these changes, and also with regards to the sensibilization. I think all these questions relative to climate are still, actually they are sometimes, they're getting more importance, but still not emotional, the emotional support they would really need. We all know that it's good to consume this or that way, but it's not enough. And this gets in conflict with what we have seen during the pandemic. There's been an incredible response, speaking about being able to change our behavior from the one day to the other and generating resources to ease on things and to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. Perhaps because the temporal tension was much shorter, and we have still this dysfunction, this impression that in this case it's not so intense, and that's an error because it's happening already, and we see it. We are experiencing these changes that are going to continue accelerating, and it's true that with the invasion of Ukraine, what we see is also reaction, a very peculiar reaction. We could call it like some sort of bubble. That we see this lack of connection. So I'm very worried about what happens Ukraine, and what does it happen for my personal life, and what the consequences of all these are. And in these circumstances, there is a first reaction I could perhaps call fear, where probably the situations that are a bit not very congruent, worried about how these things are going to affect my personal life, and I'm going to try to look for very short-term solutions. And this is logical up to a certain extent. It's difficult to substitute our prime materials, but we can't, of course, get away from the path we need, and we can't reduce this challenge. And so it's true too that in this context we are in, particularly, it's very important to remember what this meant. The mandate of Mr. Ban Ki-moon as Secretary General of the United Nations, because this allowed us to have a very spectacular legacy we should all be proud of. And all these years of work will belong to history. It was the years where we were able to get to an agreement, to a common agenda 2030 with sustainable development goals, Paris Agreement, the mechanisms of early alert with regards to disasters. And we see that, luckily enough, we had already identified these kind of orientations, general orientation. Otherwise, it would have been even more difficult. And we have to extract all the needed conclusions of this legacy in order to react adequately in these circumstances we are, and not to get biased in a peculiar movement that would be terrible for the development of and the well-being of persons, in order to avoid suffering of many people in many different countries, and not to forget the rhythm of change that is very deep, in order to have to biodiversity, loss of diversity, and pollution as a consequence of how we are living and consuming. So it's obvious there are many elements that are very important in this moment, and it's true we need flexibility with a response at the short term, but also we have not to forget what the main goals in medium and long range term, and we have to work together with this common legacy that is represented by Mr. Ban Ki-moon. one of the four where we have to work together clearly. And after Paris are the COPs, the conferences of the parties, where we have all this, we're renewing all these compromises, and that's why I would like to ask this question to Mr. Ban Ki-moon. This year it's going to be in Egypt, in a context where as we have the Deputy Prime Minister said, the war is not only posing problems to the energy all over the world, but also the security, food security. And Egypt, particularly, and Africa, generally speaking, is one of the regions that is more affected by this. And basing us on your own experience, what could be done in this context by the multilateral organizations and governments in collaboration in order to continue mobilizing this financing, that so needed financing, in order to accompany this challenge of climate change.
Gracias, señoras y señores. Es un gran.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure.
Gracias. To your questions about the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November this year, it is going to be one of the most important and crucially important occasions. Why? Never in the past the international community has been peaceful or prosperous, but even then, the member states of the United Nations have been able to consolidate their political will. That's what happened in Paris Climate Change Agreement. That's what happened in September 25th at the United Nations, when whole world's leaders came to the United Nations and adopted Sustainable Development Goals. To have a Paris Agreement, we have gone through many processes, like COP meetings. For me, starting from 2007 Bali roadmap until 2015, when we were able to finally agree on Paris Climate Change Agreement. That was 23rd year since international community began to talk about climate change in Kyoto 1992. But I am proud that all these two most important agenda pathways were adopted during my time, and I'm proud that to have prioritized these two issues, Sustainable Development Goals and also climate change agreement. If I may add one more, gender empowerment, women's empowerment. Those are three top priorities which I have set and achieved some. I don't claim that I have achieved all, but I have presented at least Paris Climate Change Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals with the 17 goals. I have presented to the world for implementation. Now, this has to be implemented by my successor and the people of the world, particularly leaders of the world. This is what I can tell you as just a beginning of my remarks. Now, what do we expect in Sharm el-Sheikh? We had a higher expectation, almost the highest expectation for Glasgow COP26. But it's a little bit half. I think more than half, frankly speaking, it was successful, but not fully successful. Because they were not able to agree on complete decarbonization, phase out coal by 2050. Instead of phase out, they agreed phase down. It's a little bit diluted. Then instead of agreeing to financial support mechanism, $100 billion, you were in Copenhagen. How terrible it was. during my 50-year diplomatic service, I have never experienced such kind of a humiliating defeat. It was a total failure. But when you are totally, ruthlessly failed, then you have some guts to stand on, not to repeat that kind of a defeat. That's why we worked very hard until Paris. Then at that time, the United States, European Union, Japan promised that they would provide $100 billion a year, every year, starting from 2021, last year. But that has not been done. I really tried to make some framework during my time, but I was not able to do that because I had to leave just 1 year after that. And then we had the highest expectation that COP26 in Glasgow, under the leadership of the United Kingdom, would be able to have a concrete plans for that. But they were not able to pass the box to Sharm el-Sheikh. Then another one, which I'm not happy, is that they passed the buck again to Sharm el-Sheikh about this carbon neutrality by 2050, because of a strong objection by a certain country, if I may say, India. India proposed 2070. They said that they could not do 2050, but they can do only by 2070. Because of that, there was no firm agreement. We hoped that the member states have agreed to face, carbon neutrality by 2050. By 2050. Then this by 2050 has been again diluted by and around the middle of the century. So it has been watered down. So it's been now passed back to Sharm el-Sheikh. My experience, metaphorically speaking, I've been speaking to all these COP as a railway station. In some stations, there are a lot of passengers ride the train, a lot of cargoes they carry. But in some stations, this train passes without any passengers or any cargo. That's what, I would not name which stations had more passengers or which stations didn't have any products. Sharm el-Sheikh is very famous, a very good place. I'm not sure how much leadership this Egyptian government would really demonstrate. I was encouraged when I spoke with President Macky Sall of Senegal, who is now chairman of the African Union. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had a telephone talk with him. Importance of African Union supporting Egyptian government so that this COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh would do their homework, which had been passed by United Kingdom. Then what he said is very encouraging remarks. Well, we don't regard the Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 as a Sharm el-Sheikh COP. That's a COP of the African Union. What a big statement. They regard this African Union summit instead of Sharm el-Sheikh COP27. I was very relieved. I've been speaking to President of Kenya, President of Ghana, and speaking to some African leaders. I'm no longer Secretary General, but as a former Secretary General who have worked passionately to have this climate change successful, then I have some responsibility now, moral responsibility. I don't have any power to pressure African leaders now, So it will be very important that the country like Spain and the European Union as a whole, encourage Egyptian government and pass your know-hows, what should be done. This is absolutely important. This is not only for Egyptian, this is for global, the world's people. Climate change does not discriminate any people, any country where you are coming from. It affects all the countries without discrimination. But depending upon where this wind blows or flood or heatings, I think there are some countries who are really affected. Now, in terms of justice, of climate justice, it is injustice if we do not do much for African countries who has contributed least to the climate phenomena. But they are the ones who are affected the most and worst. So I say that this is injustice, that we have to do much more for the small island developing countries and all Caribbean and South Pacific, a small island, and also developing countries. I'm working now as a chairman of the Global Center on Adaptation, headquartered in Netherlands. It has about 40 member states, mostly European Union, and some countries like Bangladesh and China and Korea and some other countries. Then I'm also working as chairman and president of the Global Green Growth Institute, which is headquartered in Korea. And using all this, my mandate as head of international organization is not as big as United Nations, but it's a small, but it's a regional and global organizations to really help world's leaders to work even harder. They have to implement their promises, which was done already in 2009. It is already now how many years now? 13 years have passed without being done anything. It's again political morality issue on the part of Americans, US government, and European government, and other OECD member states to do much more at this time. So nobody can do it alone. My message has always been clear and strong. Nobody can do it alone, however powerful, however resourceful one country may be. United States, European Union, you are very powerful, resourceful, a lot of money, but you cannot do it alone. We have to work together, and we have put our hands all together on the deck. That's basic approach, which we have to address in this one. Thank you.
El secretario general ha mencionado muchos temas.
Secretary General has spoken about many relevant subjects in this discussion, specifically the fact of this present situation caused by the most developed countries in the world and that are most suffering. Those that are most suffering are the most vulnerable countries. And in some cases, we have seen a reluctancy in these countries, not because they don't aspire to achieve these goals, but because they don't have the needed capacities. That's why I would like to ask our Deputy Prime Minister, Spain, that supports since the beginning bilateralism. What can we do in order to strengthen these capacities also with regards to neighbors? I think it's very important to work in a financing line we've already agreed on, and that achieves that these resources go towards compatible development with Paris Agreement and already in the first articles, it's not only a question of the $100 billion, but also it's a commercial investment, a private investment, and all this has to be produced at high speed. At the same time, in the same measure, we have to learn about the right to how to take the right decisions. There are fields where it is very important to work in a direct way. So there is a public financing part that has to be transferred to the funds and to resources that may contribute to orientate the right development. But it's also important to activate other things. From Paris, we're going to continue partnership in regional partnerships towards specific initiatives about solar energy, eolic energy, how to facilitate access to the capacity of producing food that is resilient in a context of climate stress. The last day we had a desertification day in Madrid, and in a private conversation with Secretary General, we saw that there's something that is of utmost importance, and is really linked to Sahel. It's the question of climate change, food security. It's life and death. Finally, it's water. It's empowerment of women, of girls, or things that make us think that construction of these kind of alliances that in some way don't need it or to organize any rules, or that are any established rules that come from the part that can be used in the direct way. We have the information we need, we have the will we need to construct this reality on the field. Means a lot in order to show, not only to address the local situations, but also to show an example of what all the things that can be done in many other fields. And I think that Spain has 2 or 3 questions that represent an additional value to all this. It's not only this multilateral dynamic we have in Spain. We have also a capacity in management, water management. We know how to live with a lack of water. We have an industry that is quite well directed in this. We have been also working on the right path. It's very democratic schemes with access to modern energies in isolated areas or in places where the demand is increasing exponentially, and all this very often passes through the same cycles and the same limitations, but it needs an effort of all the others, because alone it's not. We are not going to achieve it. And here there is work with different stakeholders from different countries, but also work with private actors. Finally, it's not only a question of transferring resources and that's all. No, it's much more complex than this. And one of the questions that is most important and is very easy to be seen once you get to the grassroots level is that the bottleneck is not only a question of resources. It's also a question of resources, but also having this exercise of seeing priorities and paying attention to all the most important needs in a specific community, and think about what human resources we dispose of in order to access this new dynamics. Do we have the needed workers? Do we have the institutional response, the adequate response in order to address this investment and keeping it up? It means to transform all these things. Needs a lot of different abilities, but of course in Europe we have a very specific responsibility, not only because of a historic charge we may have on our shoulders, but also because we should be much more generous in these partnerships. Not only also it's a question of financing, but also directly working on the field, on the grassroots level, trying to build up with respect the priorities that may be identified and these capacities and the real solution. And for this, we don't need any COPs. It's perfect to have the COPs because they help to continue adding and growing. But we don't need anybody tell us that there is a written rule, because we don't need it. It's a non-written rule. Development has to be compatible with our limits. To put the persons in the center is very important, and to work with now there is no Secretary General said there is no B planet, and it's not only a question of not having a planet B. Our A planet is much smaller than we thought. We have the luck that instead of having a virus that closes up at home, we had a certain margin in order to manage the change. But it's not so much finally the time we have. So you say there's not so much time, and specifically the Secretary General spoke about the disparity of the aims. The declaration of India of postponing the objective of decarbonization or carbon neutrality and to bring it to 2070. There we are very conscious about our delays, and he spoke already about the case of African Union and the president of the African Union who agrees in that this meeting should continue and should foster this ambition. We are very often speaking about this ambition, and I don't want to speak about if it's optimistic or not, but could we reconduce these goals at time? What has been achieved with Agenda 2030, and with the pandemics and the war in Ukraine in midst that are now being questioned. I mean, with regards to the term, do we have the time? Yes, please. Yes. No, I'd like to ask first the ex-Secretary General, and then to see it from the European perspective.
We have prioritized these SDG goals were adopted during my time with the whole passionate support by whole member state leaders. That was the moment I think the international community was wholeheartedly united. Then, frankly speaking, can we say that these all 17 goals could be completed, implemented by 2030? Frankly speaking, I'm not optimistic. It will not happen. Can you make sure that by the end of 2030, there will be nobody who would suffer from abject poverty? I think there will be still many people. WFP announced, because of this Ukrainian situation, that just during last 2-3 months, the people who are suffering from abject poverty rose from 1.5 some billion people to more than double, 2.5 billion people, particularly in Africa. People are starving, dying. Because while Ukraine is known as a breadbasket of the world, there are 25 million tons of wheat are just frozen without being exported to Africa. And that's why President Macky Sall of Senegal, on behalf of African Union, he went to Moscow and appealed to President Putin. It was reported in the newspaper. President Putin, according to this, showed some flexibility, but nothing happened. Russian warships are blocking this Black Sea. That's one thing. Then can we make sure that by 2030, there will be nobody who will die from preventable diseases? I think there will still be. A lot of people died because of the COVID-19, but because of inequality of vaccine availability. People in developed countries had four jabs. I myself had 4 jabs. But the countries like in Yemen, only 2% of people had 1 vaccination. In most of the Africans, they don't they don't have capacity to vaccinate all of their people. So there is a clearly inequality of vaccine. One say that vaccine justice again, injustice. Then can we make sure that by that time, then all school-aged children could finish their secondary education? I don't think so. There are still many. If you go to Africa and other developing countries, you will see many children playing on the street. When I began my job, I was wondering why there are so many children there on the street at the time of study, because they don't have any capacity to accommodate all these people. So there are still a lot of inequality. This should be solved by some compassionate leadership of OECD and Americans and Japanese and all these rich people. Then United Nations has promoted this during my time, during my successor's time, Kofi Annan. In 2000, the world's people, leaders have agreed that OECD member states should provide 0.7% of their GNP to developing countries. As of today, the average is 0.35%, just a half of 7%. During my time, the deadline was 2015. From 2000 to 2015, my time, I decided to extend this time frame another 15 years, another 2030, by 2030. There are only 6 countries in the world who are keeping this promise of 0.7%, mostly these northern European countries. Some countries do even 1%. But Americans, all this, most of the OECD averages 0.35%. I have been speaking out all the times as a former Secretary General, including my country, Korea. So please do keep your promise. So sometimes I've been speaking out angrily, with angry face. Why we are not doing this enough? So promise must be kept. This is a long time promise, and they are not doing. That's why people cannot be vaccinated. People just die from hunger. So Club de Madrid, I think they reached out many world leaders speaking about the possibility of all these 17 goals achievability. And I myself, through my foundation, working with the Asian Development Bank, we worked, and many agencies worked out, and appealed to Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Then I went to New York, and I met him in person. Look, I am afraid that this SDG may not be able to be implemented by 2030. Therefore, before you leave for United Nations, you better prepare another successor vision. SDG will be end by 2030. Whether it will be termed SDG 2 or whatever name it may be, then we may have to do it. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has circulated, having considered all the recommendations from Club de Madrid and et cetera, decided to convene a summit meeting on social summit meeting in 2025. Then 5 years, from 2025 to 2030, they have to negotiate to make much better, much more perfect vision. I don't know, maybe we may have to defer it by another 15 years. Unfortunately, But this is reality. But just seeing at the reality, if you don't take any action, you are not the leaders. So leader, even though we are disappointed, we will have to make sure that there is a plan and there is a sense of hope, that we have to give the sense of hope that we can do it with a passion. This is my, I'm going to press in this one. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Hablando de liderazgos.
Speaking about leadership, European Union has said that it's going to help in this battle against climate change. They has been doing it for there we have the European Green Deal as one of its main goals in order to transform the European continent on one side, and also in order to contribute to fight against climate change and against the challenges of the planetary or global emergency. I'd like to ask our co-chair of the Club of Rome, with this project with Open Society, this identifies very well what have been the different steps and what is the path to follow in order to get, and also the risks that this may suppose for certain countries. Are we the champions of climate change? Do we have ambitious goals on the table? Lots of resources are needed to achieve, but this is also going to have consequences because our rules are not so easy to be fulfilled by third countries. How can we try that these externalities are less negative for those that are more vulnerable?
Question, and it's such a pleasure to be on this panel with two very esteemed friends but also leaders, and I think that the compassionate leadership and also the words of the Vice Prime Minister around the fact that we actually have most of the tools in the toolbox is what we need to think about. As you know, Cristina, the Club of Rome, and some of you may not know, but we published a report in 1972 called The Limits to Growth. So when I hear India say that we're going to wait till 2070 to actually reflect on what was already said in 1972, that is 100 years. 100 years. And just yesterday, there was a memo revealed by Jimmy Carter where actually he was warned that climate change would totally change the way in which we engage with our economy and the planetary boundaries in 1978. So I want to bring in the element of time and the element of planning, which is exactly what Mr. Ban Ki-moon has indicated. The European Green Deal is a potential plan. The issue is, how do you translate that plan into reality? In the midst of what I call the 3 Cs, so climate, COVID, and conflict, because that is the key problem. We are going to have to plan now, even though we knew 50 years ago that we would be in the middle of this environmental tipping point and also a series of social tipping points. We have to now plan in the middle of chaos. And planning in the middle of chaos is very difficult because what happens is you have short-term reactions. Short-term decision-making, both in the boardroom, where we have the investment community now going back on the signals that we gave them to move towards renewables. They are all hedging on gas. Short-term signals in the political corridors, because what do we have? Let's quickly build LNG terminals. Let's think through actually how we can get access to food, rather than addressing the dependencies and the systemic issues that we have created as human beings, which is we have total dependency on Russia for gas and energy, oil and coal, and also some materials, and the Ukraine in terms of food, because exactly as was indicated, it is the breadbasket. These unholy dependencies are also continued through a series of other colonial dependencies around natural resources that we also have created through perverse incentives, perverse trade, and perverse governance. So when we looked at this as members of the club, and myself in particular, working with former Commissioner for Environment and Research and Innovation, Janusz Potocznik, and we brought in systemic and also OSF, so a funding body that also looks very much at how you can transform a mission like the European Green Deal into a global mission. Because what did we find? Well, first, if the Green Deal goes forward, we will have to create buffers. We will have to figure out how we protect European industry. At a time when we know that Africa is suffering even more now from food. So here's the thinking. If we look at our food policy and localize food policy to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we will have a direct impact on actual producers in Africa, Latin America, and those that are actually sending us food, not to mention Ukraine. If we look at our energy policy, it is the same effect. If we look at our materials policy and the way in which the steel industry and the aluminium industry very rightly are saying to policymakers at the European level, you have to protect us because we are actually costing externalities into our production. We are moving towards climate neutrality. We are doing what is responsible. And yet we know that then we would have trade disruption with other more vulnerable countries. So what this systems compass does is it very clearly looks at first, and this is what is so important about what has just been said, how do we implement the SDGs into practice when we're thinking about the way in which our policy may impact most of the world? How do we show leadership in Europe and that we can both have a social and Green Deal, because that is what is important, continue to heighten capacity building, employment, to ensure that people actually have the right welfare and the right well-being, but by the same token, we are not penalizing most of the world as we move forward, because it is our moral responsibility and our leadership responsibility to ensure that we are leaders for the world, not just of Europe. And so we unpacked from an economic perspective what each impact could potentially be. And how do we ensure that not only we get the 100 billion, which is absolutely fundamental, but that actually we put in place, exactly as was said by the Vice Prime Minister, the right programs in terms of not development aid, but actual collaboration, actual joint innovation and co-creation of economies that are not determined by GDP growth, because, by the way, that is the other message of what we say at the Club of Rome. You need other indicators now to demonstrate that we truly are using our economy to service people, planet, and prosperity. And that means addressing a value system that really places a value on people, on nature, and clearly addresses those aspects within human development, not just productive growth. Because the other key issue is the fact that the over-financialization of our economy means that actually the trigger mechanisms of the economy are no longer relative to people's lives and livelihoods. Now we see that you can actually fire thousands of people as a company and your shares go up. We're seeing strikes across Europe. In Belgium, I live in Belgium. On Monday there was a full national strike, and tomorrow there is a strike for pilots. Why? Because during COVID we got rid of capacity, now we're out of COVID and we're not rehiring. And that is a signal supposedly of economic strength. So the perversities within our system is why we've decided through this systems hub lens, this systems compass lens, that if you look at how you can optimize between different systems, in energy, for example, we're only talking about supply. No one is talking about efficiency. We have to reduce demand. In food, many of my friends, governments in Africa, have forgotten that their primary responsibility is to make sure that all their people have access to food. And that Europeans feel responsible, all of us, in solidarity with African citizens in order to ensure access. We need to put in place, and we have them, the right mechanisms, the right policies. So my last word would be, I really believe that this is the moment. This is the time to tap into the subconsciousness of people as we've gone through COVID, to remind people that when we were in COVID, what was most important to us? Access to food, access to energy, access to water, access to health care, access to vaccines, making sure that our friends and our family were healthy and well. Not how many cars we owned, not how many houses we owned, not how much clothes we owned. And that is what we now need to say. The European Commission will most likely, with member states, in the next 2 months, have to be dramatic in terms of energy use and in terms of food. That may mean rationing across Europe. And I have had conversations with the President and her cabinet and others, MEPs, and we know that what we have to do is properly communicate to people, to citizens of Europe, and say, in solidarity we stand with the Ukrainians. In solidarity we know that we can reduce the amount of energy that we can consume, and we can, in solidarity, truly transform our economies, our way of life, so that there is greater well-being for all, and not just for a few.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. We are going to continue with this communication because it's, of course, it's my field. I'm not going to resist myself to deepen more in it. No. I'd like to hear you. No, but once again, I'd like to bring to discussion all this question about the just transition and the climate justice, where we speak about how this impacts on others, but also how this impacts on our societies. And I'd like to ask our Deputy Prime Minister about this subject, about how we are addressing this question from our societies, from European societies. And I'd like you also to tell us if there is anything of the things that have been said now from the citizens' assemblies we have been, citizens' climate assemblies we have seen already in Spain, because it's also a question of seeing how we speak about things and how we get people to participate in all these debates that affect us so much, as has been said now. And I'd like you to tell us a bit about this experience, not only what got out of it in terms of content, but also the experience of getting people close to this debate. Thank you very much. I think this is still being something very interesting to select 100 citizens, different levels of studies, different ages, different geographic ports in Spain, with a standard knowledge that any average citizen may have. Nobody any link to climate questions, or treating about experts that work respectfully, because they are trying to get general ideas that may answer to this question. Well, this has been something very interesting. It was quite difficult because during these 8 months they had to work a lot online, because there were moments where they couldn't meet. But finally it was really very interesting, and because of many questions, because of first of what Sandrine told us now, this message we have to give our citizens, this public responsibility, our have to access information, and we can't. A surplus of information may sometimes is also maybe also be agreements, and we have to give the people possibility of having access to better news and to more appropriate news. And all this has to be working. And all this has been very interesting, because it has allowed us to continue working with this. And there are many things that are similar to what have been said by people have said have experienced similar experiences in other countries, and others that have been quite peculiar or very specific for our countries. Some things, as I said, have happened also in other countries. Participation in this exercise of citizens with a medium or average knowledge, and see climate as an important issue, but not something that they feel is a personal priority. And finally, we get them to be really as some sort of activists, so to say, and people who really feel very, very, very attached by this problem. And one of the things we saw also, and this afterwards had been told by these or by many of these citizens, that some of them during the first 2 months they even couldn't sleep because of the anxiety they felt, because they didn't understand why society was not reacting with the needed speed we needed in a situation like this. And so we were very close to this. And there was a moment I thought we can't manage without a filter this anxiety experienced by so many people that may be even counterproductive. But it's curious because the reaction of all these persons, independently of their political affiliation, their region, their age, first of all, they kept some sort of open mind. They understood the idea of this exercise, and they wanted to participate and spend their time. And the recommendation that was recommended by what 172 recommendations show up to what extent we have common sense when we work collectively. It was recommendation with a really very high level. Things that are already being done, others are not easy to implement on the short term. Others have this so to say fresh air look of people who are being confronted the first time with this. And there are some scenarios that have to do with the commentaries that Sandrine has made now, or what you asked me now, Cristina, about this behavior as a consumer and how the signals and this problem with consuming in these indicators that may be very useful for many things, but it doesn't necessarily reflect human evolution, but reflect other things, important things, but it has to be complemented by other indicators. And all this, they understood, the citizens understood it perfectly well, as well, almost as an intuition. And they saw this need of being much more intelligent in the way of taking our decisions about consuming. And I think it's an exercise we have to still continue working on. We have to continue with debates on this. I think one of the most positive things about this was that these same persons are normal citizens, average citizens, in these kind of debates. Questions about how to get a step further in our conscience and how to prepare society to address this needed and this urgent changes. So the fact of having this normal citizens that understand and follow this debate. So it's not institutionalized citizens like the case of political representation or the case of academic representation in certain sectors. So that's why I think it was really very, very important. And at the same time, I think that the main challenge is time. What Sandrine told us now, the data about the position also about India, 1972. In Stockholm, we had now the 50th anniversary of the Conference of Stockholm, and the report of a Club of Rome that activated all this program that has been so important. And I would say it was, Mrs. Secretary General, it was the key element of multilateralism in the United Nations. In this first consideration of the Conference of Stockholm, these big tendencies, these practical tendencies of construction of peace and prosperity by means of multilateralism have been going in this direction. Of course, also peacekeeping, working on other issues, but the main tendency, the big success, the big story has to do with this. And it's true that since academics speak about this, governments understand, institutions absorb, and then we get to the next step, to the daily transformation and the real transformation. It's too much time that passes, and nature has a watch that doesn't work, or a clock that works in a different way. Many things have changed. The curve of renewable energies, but you have to multiply this by 3. If you just multiply it by 2, so this gap is still increasing and increasing. with regards to what we're doing. And this is the big challenge and the big worry we have. And that's why on one side we need this holistic idea of everything and simultaneous and everything very coherent. But parallel to that, if we want to accelerate the rhythm so that these things happen, we need many small things and many intermediate things that are get catalyzed, that are the engines that help us to accelerate on all these fronts. And obviously, the capacity of absorption and of pressure of the societies is different because of cultural reasons, because of levels of concern, of development. But finally, I think that there is a common and shared feeling that we have to foster this. We have, as we said before, we have to activate and accelerate in this very moment without a minute to lose. It's very interesting what you say. When people get confronted to reality, what all this means. First, the first reaction is most suffering. This anxiety. Well, young people perhaps have seen it earlier. And another thing very interesting is there have been two reactions, very interesting reactions. First of all, when the first day all the citizens after this exercise of telling people who have been selected for this program and so on, we want you to help us in order to see what can be done. And they looked at each other with horror, one the other, and said, we have to answer this question. Let the expert answer it. How should we be able to answer these questions? And that was the first NGT reaction. And then, since they were understanding what it means, that was the second NGT reaction. Of course, not it was not homogeneous. Not everybody would react the same way. But this capacity of empowering people is very important. Not to be active citizens, not passive citizens that wait somebody to tell you how problems are to be solved. Facilitate this reflection process, because that, I think, that produces resilience, that helps society to be more demanding and to accept better when changes happen, regulatory questions or education changes. I mean, we have to play well this. Sorry for interrupting you, because I think there were two very interesting reactions we had there. Yes, just one thing, because there, at the same time, we had also data, as a Reuters Institute said, about our reaction towards with regards to news and our rejecting bad news. The interest has not only dropped 30% for news. Spirit of survivance, the challenge of bad news, with us also with the climate room, with the limits of growth, and where we're accused of catastrophism. And so I think that's not something you wanted to say about this.
I think, we were called the Doomsday Club for many years. And I think that, first of all, I really believe that we need to tap into our humanity. And everyone has some level of humanity, even those that we think are bad. The fact is, we are in an emergency. We all know it. We talked about climate anxiety. There is also eco-anxiety in those that are living, indigenous people that are seeing their forests being destroyed, but even those in small towns in the United States or in Canada who have seen burning fire come through, and their entire towns are devastated. Same thing with Australia, hence why we have the new government. And I think that there are two things. If you tap into that, it's very convenient for policymakers and business leaders to say it's too difficult. I think we need to start to be strong and ambitious and realize that this is the greatest existential risk to humanity. And these citizen assemblies are key because it allows you to have a discussion. It's exactly what the Vice Prime Minister has said. It gives you that interface. People now, and especially in Western Europe and also in the United States, we have the first generation of youth that are going to make less than their parents. We have the highest rates of suicide and the highest rates of mental illness. We cannot pretend that actually people are well and happy. And in our analysis that we've just done for the 50th anniversary, which is actually called Earth for All, we brought together scientists and modelers, in fact, one of the original authors of the Limits to Growth, that did system dynamic modeling. And then we brought in economists from the north and the south, from all over the world, to stress test that modeling. And what did we see? We actually saw that you could look at food, energy as the basics for survival, but also inequality, poverty, and empowerment, what we call the 5 turnarounds. And you could actually put in place clear tax incentives, labeling projects really as green, and that's another conversation that we've had with Spain in terms of what is green, not gas and nuclear, but other very clear investments. And these points you can do at 2 to 3% of GDP globally annually. 2 to 3%. Totally transform. That's the hope. We have the possibility to completely transform, but we cannot transform by just looking at food and energy without looking at empowerment, in particular gender empowerment, inequality, and poverty. And I think the last point I want to make, which is very important, coming back to the positive spin, I think it's important to not just have the positive spin, to really embody the sense of urgency, but to also say we can do it through this solidarity and transformation by optimizing our intelligence, our hearts and our souls, by putting in place the capital so that we really shift the capital to where it needs to go. There is so much wastage in how we spend our money at the public level and at the private level. And people have said, and so we've done surveys also for this new analysis, for this Earth for All study, which will come out actually, and we will hopefully launch it at the next UN General Assembly in September. We have interviewed G20 citizens, so this includes citizens in China, it includes citizens in other parts of the world, not just the United States and Europe. 75% of those G20 citizens clearly indicate that actually our economy is broken and they want a well-being economy. Wealth, we have seen in our studies, wealth goes up and well-being is going down. The disparity is huge. 90% in G20, again, this is not Western Europe, say very clearly, climate change is here and we feel it personally. So to continue to not have real leadership when actually citizens, not only in the assemblies, but across the globe are saying, we understand there's a problem, please lead us and let us know what we need to do collectively. It is time now for us to have that leadership.
Muchas gracias, Sandrine. No sé si de las
Thank you very much. I don't know if the authorities that are here with us, anybody who wants to make any question. Otherwise, I'm going to ask our ex-Secretary General, who is leading and now the Global Green Growth Institute that researches and makes also proposals in order to foster all these necessary changes. And we are speaking about the transformations and about to get to them. It's a fundamental pillar of these transformations that are the works. We have now the capacities in one and each of our societies for this transformation. I know that the Institute has done studies related with these works that we need for a more sustainable future. And I'd like Mr. Ban Ki-moon to tell us something more, to share some of his proposals in this sense.
This organization, Global Green Growth Institute, was established 10 years ago during Rio Plus 20 summit meeting in Rio de Janeiro at the initiative of Republic of Korea. The headquarters is now in Seoul, and I'm chairing as a president of the assembly and chairman of the council. During last 10 years, it has expanded significantly to 43 member states. It's an international organization. Mostly, they are developing countries. So we try to provide, because of any organization has some shortages of funding. So therefore, we try to provide the necessary funding. At the same time, we liaise with global organizations, and particularly financial organizations, to liaise them. Like we have Global GCF, Global Funding for Climate. This was established by the decision of the Paris Agreement, and it is headquartered in Korea. But since the promise to mobilize $100 billion is not much well-functioning, but they have some minimum funding. They try to provide those countries to green their economy, and to adapt to the changing climate situation. I've been traveling and meeting with the party, state parties of this GGGI, and try to listen to their challenges, what international community should do. Then we try to liaise with the European Union or some other Asian Development Bank or the World Bank, IMF, etc., etc. That is what we really try to do. We just celebrated 10th anniversary just last month. Even though this is a small organization, but I am very proud that we are doing. Our motto is that make your economy green and fight back climate change. And another organization which I'm leading is, as I said earlier, Global Center on Adaptation. Mostly European Union member states are joining, but they are determined to help African countries. We are very much working closely with the African Development Bank, and just to help African countries adapt to this changing situation. Now, what is adaptation? This is one of the just two policy responses. One is mitigation. I think everybody knows that we have to mitigate, reduce greenhouse gas emissions and whatever, but not much awareness about the need for adaptation. Invest wisely in advance to prevent climate disasters. For example, we encourage them to forestation and stop deforestation. Recently, just 2 months ago, I visited Colombia, and a long time before, I visited Amazon River basins. Colombia is also Amazon River basins. There's a rampant deforestation taking place without knowing what will be the consequences of this. Then Africa, I think we are really trying to help them to adapt to, first of all, for example, how you can have very resilient foodstuffs, and how you can be prepared against any unexpected floodings, and how to make sure that you have enough water. You mentioned the water shortages. These are some of the ideas. For example, very simple, very easy. When you go to small island developing countries, for them, sea level rising is a serious matter, serious problem for them. I visited Kiribati. That's a small island. The highest point above is just 3 meters above sea level, highest point in that. Then I was told by old people there, when they look far away island, some days this island disappear because they have been submerged. when I visited Marshall Island, in the hotel, I was provided with a life jacket. It may be too much, because while we sleep, then the sea tide may just swept away. This is a reality. So in such a case, simple and easy, planting trees alongside the sea level so that they can prevent the tidal water may just wash away this sand. So these are small ideas, but there are small and big ideas. How to invest climate-resilient infrastructure. Just to build buildings, houses, or office buildings, or pavement. If we invest wisely to make a resilient infrastructure, that can be the way to adapt to changing climate consequences. Those are some examples which we are doing with the limited resources. I'm asking European Union and all this, if we invest, for example, $1.7 trillion a year worldwide on adaptation, then in 10 years' time, we may reap the positive effect of more than $7 trillion. That's what scientists have been calculating. So we are trying to ask IMF, World Bank, and African Development Bank. We have some ambitious target of mobilizing $25 billion for African continent. The African Development Bank promised to provide $12.5 billion. The rest of the $12.5 billion should come from European Union, etc. We are working very closely on this. Now, my point is that while we invest to mitigate and decarbonize, but at the same time, we have to look beyond for the future shock. One simple idea, in India and Pakistan, when they have sunny days all the times, painting the roof white may also deflect the sun rays. This is simple. So we are just giving some ideas to the population. Do whatever you can to protect us from any possible climate consequences. So I think for that, we need to educate the people. And I've been really, again, emphasizing the importance of environment education on climate. So when young students enter elementary school, then from that time, they should be given the quality education and teach them that the number one priority for our world is to adapt and address climate change issues. Now, I heard that Madrid, the citizens, suffered from heat waves last week. The hottest month, July last year, was the hottest month ever recorded in human history. Last year. Nobody recognized this one, but this is what scientists, WMO has announced. And the hottest summer, 5 hottest summers recorded in the history happened since 2015, just 8 years ago. So during last 8 years, the humanity has experienced the hottest summers ever recorded in human history. Yeah. This is what we have to understand. The climate change, I've been speaking out that climate change is approaching much, much faster than we may think. So unless we really prepare to prevent any unwanted consequences, we have to do.
Sandrine quería reaccionar a lo que estaba
Sandrine wanted to react what
adaptation. We are too fixated on mitigation. I fully agree with you. And if you look at the sustainable finance taxonomy and the schemes that we tried to do at the European level, for 2.5 years, we put together investors, scientists, economists, and policymakers. And we unpacked what is real mitigation and what is adaptation. So we could build resilience by ensuring that we shift capital to what is truly green. And after 2.5 years, we had a very strong recommendation. I was part of that group. I chaired the manufacturing sector, so I wasn't in some kind of fluffy world. And we sat down with the European Investment Bank and other investors, the EBRD, and we clearly said, okay, this is it. This is how we get to climate neutrality. This is what we need in terms of mitigation. This is what we need in terms of adaptation. What happened? Politics. And through the politics, not in this country, because again, this Vice Prime Minister stayed true to the recommendations of the taxonomy. But because of the incumbents of gas and nuclear and the interests in certain countries, that scientific data was thrown out the window out of 2.5 years. So my last point is very clear. Not only do we have the science, but we even had the investment community. We now have the first multilateral development bank that has declared itself a climate bank, the European Investment Bank. And it's the policymakers in certain countries that are not listening to their citizens or even to the scientists and to the investment community that is saying, we can do this and we agree. Again, responsible leadership is what is fundamental, and we all have to be holding these leaders accountable for staying true to climate neutrality by 2050, not by 2070.
Thank you so much. Como anfitriona, te paso la.
As a host, I'd like to give you the floor. Sorry for this delay, but anyway, I would like to finish saying that it has been very interesting. We're going to continue working on this so this reaches out to more and more persons. Thank you very much. In 2 minutes, I'm going to close this debate with two very important messages, or very powerful messages. It's capital not only to be responsible from the point of institutional or political point of view. It's difficult to ask coherency citizens to citizens if you are not coherent with our public responsibility, and it's capital in difficult moments like this with being humble. But it is important, and I believe that we are losing time in our race against time, and something we are not very often not conscious about how much this will cost us, and we have to see all the opportunities we see in order to trigger these changes. And the third question I think is very important. It was very interesting that the former Secretary General, the question of the empowerment of women and the reduction of this imbalance that still exists. And I would even go further. Generally speaking, the different imbalances we have, Sandrine has also spoke about this, to make a revolution is very difficult if people don't get along. And so we need a huge revolution. And in order to get people along with us, those who are in a most vulnerable situation have to feel that they are backed, that there's somebody helping them. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult in the short term and very contradictory situations. And I think that all these things, of course, is difficult. Education, to understand what happens and to understand, to absorb the change from a liberal point of view. All this is very important, very difficult, but it's true also to explain this, not with just speaking about the difficulties. We could just put like bullet points on a paper, but explaining the list of opportunities and the reasons because of which we are interested in doing it is fundamental. So the way of presenting things is something that counts too, and it's capital to underscore the reasons, the positive reasons, because of which this would be a positive stimulus for the whole of our society in globally. With this positive message, thank you very much. An applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. Cristina, you have moderated very well. Thank you, Secretary General, Sandrine. Thank you all for being with us today before or behind the camera. Thank you very much.